What if events went differently? What if Harry Osborn was bit by the spider? How would Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies change? Find out in today's fan fiction. I want to give a big thank you for the support for part 1 and 2 of the 2002 fan fiction. A lot of you guys are really enjoying this series, and I hope to continue both parts by topping part 1 and 2 with this episode of What If. Let's continue the Osborn Saga, and before we do, make sure you check out part 1 and 2 of the 2002 fan fiction before watching this one, so you guys are all up to date with it. Anyways, let's get right into the fan fiction. Harry would swing home from his father's funeral. He would crawl up the window to make sure that nobody was there. He didn't want to scare Bernard. He would look around to see the Goblin mask was still smashed on the ground with blood and glass everywhere. He would see that it was really dark and nobody was around. He would crawl looking around and he could see that the Green Goblin mask was staring into his eyes. Harry would be teleported into a dream sequence in his mind. Harry would look at his hands and he would turn his head up and he could see that he was in a car and he could see Norman Osborn in the car looking at him. Harry was about to strangle him, but his father would talk to him in the car. Harry would be confused, not knowing what his father was saying. He would hear his dad shouting, telling him something, and he would be repeating something, but he didn't know. All he could hear was mumbling and an echo of screaming, and noises saying that you failed me would get louder and louder until Harry would snap back into reality looking at the Goblin mask. Harry would throw it and it would smash into a wall, breaking the glass. Glass would break, falling to the ground, and Harry would run to see how much damage he did. He knew he had to clean it before Bernard could get there. He would look into the mirror, seeing himself in a goblin suit shattered, but he could also see his ripped up costume. Harry would be shocked to see the door was hollow. The mask that he just threw had gone through the wall. He knew this wasn't right, and he would smash the rest of the glass, crawling through it. He would use his hands to move the cobwebs out of the way so he could see it was complete darkness until each section of the room would light up with a noise, and the noises would go off, turning on the power. He could see pumpkin bombs on the shelves, and Harry couldn't believe what he was looking at. It was all his, and he knew he couldn't keep it there. What was he going to do? Harry would hear footsteps coming closer and closer, and his spider sense would go off. Nobody was there though. He would circle the room trying to figure out where it was coming from. Was it a ghost? A shadowy figure would come out walking towards Harry, and he would tell him that it was okay, son, don't be scared. Harry would yell at the figure, telling him to show himself. The figure would walk out of the shadows, and it would be Bernard. Harry would see him, and he would walk towards him, having tears in his eyes. All of the pain would go through him, coursing through his veins. It would all hit him right then and there. Bernard would walk towards Harry, and he would fall to the ground, telling him it wasn't what it looked like, but Bernard told him it was okay, and he would put his hand on Harry, telling him he knows what he's been through, and that he's been through a rough time, but now he's here for him, and Harry would hug him. We would cut to the morning, and an alarm clock would go off. Peter would look at it, getting up fast, and he knew that he was going to be late for work. He knew this was the day he was finally going to meet Otto Octavius, and things were finally going to change, but he knew that he could actually get fired if he doesn't make it in time. How could he get fired? He knew that Harry wouldn't fire him, but in the back of his head, he had to be professional. Peter would get ready, and he would open the door to see MJ. MJ would tell Peter if he was okay with everything that happened, and Peter would look at MJ saying, yeah, I'm fine, and MJ would tell Peter she was here because she had great news to tell him, and he would be confused, not knowing what it might be, and she would tell Peter she was going to be starring in a play, and he would smile, congratulating her for it. Peter would tell MJ he was happy to hear, and Peter would slowly walk away. MJ would take his hand, telling him that she was sorry for everything, and things would start to escalate. Peter would tell her he was going to be late for work, and MJ would ask for one last chance, telling Peter he was a great guy and that she wanted to be with him, and Peter would tell her it was too late for that, and that he was a changed man. She would let go, nodding her head, and Peter would have a tear in his eye, walking out of the apartment. Peter would walk into an alleyway, kicking the wall in anger over and over again, remembering the words of Norman Osborn. He knew girls were the only thing slowing his work down, and deep down he knew that he was right. He had a responsibility to share his gifts with the world and share it with Otto Octavius. Peter would walk out of the alleyway onto a bus, and he would sit down. The bus would slowly start to move until until he could hear a loud sonic noise. He would hear screaming and people were starting to run. He would look at his watch knowing he was going to be late for work. He would start swearing at the driver, telling him if he could move any faster. A sonic blast would go through the bus and Peter would go flying, smashing his face off of a metal bar, and he would hit his face off of a seat. People in the bus would start screaming and some people would start clapping. Peter would get up and he would see Spider-Man taking down Shocker. Spider-Man would crawl around Shocker's chest on the street and he would wrap his webs around his arms, kicking him to the ground. Sirens would go off and the police would arrive at the scene. Spider-Man would web up Shocker, leaving him for the cops, and Peter would crawl up looking at this and he would look at the blood on his hand and making a fist. The cops would tell everybody to get off of the bus as fast as they could, and Peter would look at his watch, wiping the blood off of his face. He knew that he was going to be late for work. Harry would swing back to Oscorp seeing Otto, and he would ask Otto, "Where's Peter?" and he would say that he's almost been late for 45 minutes. Harry would tell Otto that he would pick him up, and Harry would get into his sports car driving off. He could see Peter walking on the street almost near Oscorp, and he would honk the horn asking if he needed a ride. Peter would smile, saying that there was a disturbance and that he didn't know if he was going to make it in time. Harry would ask Peter why he was late, and he would say that he was on a bus and that it was hit from a sonic blast from Shocker, and he would make a fist and Harry would see it. He would tell him if he was okay, telling Peter that they could maybe make this for another day, but Peter would lash out, telling Harry this was his future, he needed to be there, and he would say that he was sorry. Harry would look at him, putting his hand on his shoulder, telling him it was okay, and he would smile, telling him his paychecks would be in the mail soon, and Peter would laugh getting out of the car. Harry would drive at the back of Oscorp and he would park the car getting out of the vehicle. He would look both ways to see if people were looking around. Harry would jump up towards the buildings, getting into a vent, and he would crawl, taking right turns into the vent, and he would use his webs to web zip to the ground. He would look around and he could see his torn up suit, and it was his old father's hideout that he had within Oscorp. Only him and Bernard knew where this was, and they would go into their operations there. Bernard would say, "Sorry sir, but I almost fixed your lenses in your suit and it should be ready soon. I made it stronger and harder to crack. I also ordered in new fabric for a new suit that should be in within 2 weeks." Bernard would give Harry his suit and he would still keep the gray Alex Ross suit for now. Harry would tell Bernard if they could maybe get this in red, and Bernard would tell him that he would take a look. Harry would explain to Bernard that his fight with Shocker went well, but now he's getting stronger. He's not sure how, but he is. He would tell Bernard he was harder to put away this time and that he almost killed a bunch of people on the bus stop, including Peter Parker. Bernard would tell Harry that it's odd Peter seems to be the one always getting into trouble, and Harry would look at him saying it's crazy, and he would take his clothes off, putting his suit underneath his business suit. Harry would tell Bernard to get the latest report on crime for every 24 hours, and the company would have more money. So in this universe, Harry is in this timeline spending more money on new tech for their operations, and he would smile, telling Harry it was no problem. Harry would walk through the doors looking around and he would shut it. He would see Otto and Peter talking about them sustaining energy for the whole city. Otto would tell Harry that they needed to do one more final thing to finish the blueprints off for the final design, and that they were ready to do their first test at the docks. Peter would smile looking at Otto Octavius, knowing he was finally going to do something for everybody to finally get their attention. Otto and Peter would explain to Harry that they had to do this and that they needed the tritium to make it work. Harry would make a joke saying if they were going to blow up the city, and Peter would laugh, cutting him off quickly, saying no, and he would explain how it was going to work and what they were going to do. Otto would tell Harry and Peter that they wanted to show them a new toy he was working on, and he would walk towards a curtain and he would take it off, revealing the 4 arms. Peter would be shocked, running towards them looking in amazement. Harry would ask Otto what do they do, and Otto would explain the details quickly, and Harry would be interrupted by Bernard. He would be shouting through the hallway and his spider sense would go off. There would be an alert in Oscorp saying danger. Harry would be shocked, telling Bernard what was going on, and Bernard would try explaining that there was an accident at the laboratory, and Peter would look at Harry and he would try yelling his name, and co-workers would start running, but Harry would book it running with Bernard. Peter would look around trying to move fast, but he lost him. Otto would tell Peter to come help him move the arms before anything bad happens. Harry and Bernard would speed walk down the hallway, and the noise was getting worse and worse as they kept getting further. Harry would yell Bernard's name and he would point at him, telling him to lock the door. He would shut the door that led into the operations room in Oscorp. Harry would get into his Spider-Man suit and his spider sense would go off. He would dodge an attack, almost being slashed in the neck, and he would do a backflip, landing on his feet in the hallway walls. He would hear a scream and he would see a massive lizard. Harry would use his webs, grabbing grabbing his badge from the lizard's lab coat, but he was too late. He would look to see that he was knocked to the ground by his giant tail. Spider-Man would smash his face off of glass and he would fall to the ground. The lizard would pick up Spider-Man by his leg, smashing his body off of the left hallway hull. The lights in Oscorp would start flickering, shutting off and on. Spider-Man would look to see the lizard creature walking away and he would start screaming. Spider-Man would crawl up slowly, waving it off. Harry knew that he had to stop whatever this thing was before it got loose into the public. He would shoot his two webs, catching the walls from across the hallway, and the lizard would turn around and he would see Spider-Man's foot, and the lizard would be hit in the face and he would go flying onto the ground. Spider-Man would web zip, seeing the creature, and he would look to see if it was knocked out. The lizard would open his eyes, grabbing Spider-Man by his neck, slowly choking him out. Otto would try moving the forearms, trying to get them into a nearby room, but they were too heavy. He would yell, telling Peter to give him a hand, but it was no use. Peter would try pushing them, using all of his strength, but he couldn't do it. Otto would shout, saying it was his life's work and that they couldn't take any risks of getting it destroyed. Peter would look at Otto, telling him what was he doing, and he would shout and yell at Otto, and Otto would look at Peter, telling him he was going to do this for the good of mankind, and he would turn around and his back would face the arms, and he would press the button and the arms would go into his back, and Otto would scream in pain, and Peter couldn't believe it. Otto would fall to the ground, but his arms would catch him. He would look at his hands and he could see that the arms finally worked. He would try using them, moving them around. Otto would hear screaming of Harry choking, and Otto would tell Peter that they had to move quickly, and Peter would tell Otto he could help, but Otto would use his arms, blocking Peter from getting through. Otto would tell him that they had to save all of this for their demonstration, and he would yell at him, telling him to leave. The lizard creature would almost choke the life out of Spider-Man, and Harry knew it wasn't going to end like this, and he would use all of his strength to move his hands off of him, and he would punch him in the eye. The lizard would freak out, squirming around, and he would slash Spider-Man in the left leg. He would start screaming, and the lizard would claw into his shoulder. He was about to finish the job off until a metal arm would go through his chest, and the lizard's eyes would roll back, and he would fall to the ground screaming. He would try crawling, getting to his feet, but the lizard would die. Otto would look to see Spider-Man was really hurt bad, and he was bleeding from his left and right shoulder and his leg. Otto would extend his hand, helping him up, and he would thank Spider-Man for helping him, and Otto would tell him that there was now two heroes within the city, and Spider-Man would almost fall to the ground, and he would thank Otto, asking Otto what it was, and he would tell him that he wasn't sure, but Oscorp was going to be looking into this. Otto would tell Spider-Man he was about to overstay his welcome, and the police sirens would be heard from the front entranceway. Spider-Man would look at Otto, and then he would look back at the front entrance, and he would swing away just in time. Harry would take his mask off, crawling up a building, and he would be exhausted. He would have blood on his hands, and he would sneak into the operations room. Otto would see the cops, and they would be shocked, and Otto would tell them not to worry, and that he had a few extra arms. They would put their guns away, looking at the dead lizard. Otto would explain to the cops what happened, and Peter would open the door to see Otto talking to the cops, and he could see the dead lizard on the ground. He would be told to go home, and Peter would be shocked, and he would walk down to the front entrance, and he would wave to Otto. Otto would shout at Peter, telling him to meet him at the docks in the morning, and he would nod his head, leaving the building. Harry would crawl from the vent, and he would fall to the ground. Bernard would tell him what happened, and Harry would tell him that he wanted to know the same thing. He would tell Bernard he needs a full investigation on the timeline from today. He wants to know who left the building and who went into the building at each part of the day. He would say right away, sir, pulling up all the timestamps on the computer screen. Harry would be putting bandages on his shoulders and legs, looking at the screen, and he could see the name Kirk Connors. He was at the department dropping chemicals off from one of the schools. Harry would demand, telling Bernard he wanted to know more about him, and they would pull up more facts on him, and he would look to see that he was a full-time professor at one of the local schools. Harry would tell Bernard that is where he's going to be going, and Bernard would tell Harry he needed to put it off because right now he has to attend that experiment in front of the shareholders for the new energy project. Bernard would tell him that he wouldn't miss it and that he had to be there no matter what. Harry would say fine, telling him that he had to get cleaned up and that he was going to meet him there in the morning. Harry would take his mask, and Bernard would ask where he was going, and he would say that he was going to fight some crime, and at the same time he was going to be getting a slice at Joe's Pizza. Harry would swing into the city, thinking to himself, was it a good idea letting Peter and Otto work on this? What if the plan fails? What would happen? And what would happen to the company? Harry would have all of these questions in his head, and he would think to himself about the giant lizard and what might be going on there. He knew he needed to please the members of the company and put an end to whatever made that lizard. Harry would look at a giant billboard in the city and he would say to himself if he was seeing things. He would see MJ's picture and moving neon letters. It would say Mary Jane Watson performing at 9 p.m. He would swing to a building, putting his arm on his shoulder, and he knew he was in pain and that he was really busy, but he thought he hadn't seen her since the funeral of his father. Maybe he would pay her a little visit and he would change into his clothes. He would crawl down an alleyway and he would look to see the building for the show, and he knew it wasn't that far away, maybe less than a block. Harry would hear a scream and it was a cop. The cop would shout at Harry, telling him to stop that guy, and Harry's spider sense would go off and he could see the robber running away from the cops. He thought not this time, and Harry would do a 360 on the street, clotheslining the robber. He would fall to the ground and Harry would kick the gun out of his hands, and the cops would look shocked and Harry would look at them and he would walk away. He would enter the building and he would buy a ticket. He could see MJ would be performing in the play and she would look into the crowd to see Harry sitting in the second row. She would almost be stopped and shocked, but she would keep saying her lines. Harry would go backstage to see MJ and she would hug him. Harry would tell her he wanted to see how she was doing, and he would explain that he saw the billboard and that he was in the city and that he had to check in on her. She would smile at Harry looking at him, and she would explain she got the job the other day and that she was really happy to see Harry. She would ask how he was doing and with the whole situation with his father. He would say that he was fine and that he was running the company now, and MJ would bring up saying Peter works there now, and Harry would smile saying he's been getting paid really well, and Harry would say it's none of his business, but he would ask how she and Peter were doing because Peter hasn't been bringing you up lately, and MJ would say that they haven't really been seeing each other and that it was over. He would say sorry and she would tell him Peter was a complicated person and that she couldn't wrap her head around him. Harry would laugh saying that makes the two of us now, and Harry would say he was happy to see her, and he would start walking away and he would say have a great day. He would smile and turn around and she would say bye, and Harry would walk outside to the front doors and MJ would shout Harry's name. MJ would ask Harry if he wanted to go out sometime, and Harry would smile saying that he would phone her, and MJ would be really happy and she would hug him. Peter would be in the crowd of people looking at MJ hugging Harry, and he would clench his fists in the distance, seeing his best friend do this. He knew it was too late to put things right, and he thought if he showed up to her play, just maybe he could set things back to normal and maybe back on track the way that they were and how they started. Peter knew Harry liked her, and he knew maybe all this time Harry was trying to get with her. Maybe that's the reason why MJ was being difficult with them. Why was Harry better than him? All these questions were going through his head, and he would start to tear up seeing MJ and Harry together, and he couldn't even take the sight of it anymore, and he would run into an alleyway. He would slip onto a puddle of water falling to the ground, and he would look at a piece of paper, and it was the old Daily Bugle headline that said Green Goblin and Spider-Man working together, and he would rip the paper and he would stand up kicking a wall screaming. Harry's alarm would go off in the morning and he would make sure to put on his best suit. Bernard would tell Harry that his car was waiting for him outside and they would both go into the car. Bernard would tell Harry that he had more news on the lizard guy and what might have happened. He would explain that Kurt Connors might have dropped off certain drugs and that they were for new tests, and Bernard would say a test subject could have taken the wrong one and that it was a new drug, and Kurt brought it into the lab that day. Harry would tell him he would talk to him about it and that he knew that he had to go as Harry Osborn and not as Spider-Man. Otto and Peter would move the machine into place, making sure it was ready to be shown to the world. Rosie would tell Otto to be safe and that if anything happens, she would shut the power off, and Peter would tell her not to worry and that this should sustain once they get everything going. People from the company would start filling in, and they would see Peter and Otto take the tritium out of the glass, and Otto would look in pure amazement. Peter would explain why Otto had 4 arms, and he would tell the crowd that he would control them using his brain. People would be shocked looking at Otto with his arms, and Harry would enter the room and Peter would look at him. Peter would tell Harry where the heck he was, and he would say it's going to be all fine, and he would continue the presentation. Peter would look at Harry in a disgusting look, and he would continue. Otto and Rosie would turn the green light on, and they would be ready to go. The beams would shoot into the reactor, and Peter and Otto would put their glasses on, and Otto would say, "The power of the sun in the palm of our hand," and Peter would start clapping. The energy would sustain, and they would all be clapping in the room, looking at the circle in the room, shining yellow light through the windows. Harry would smile, and he would look to see that it actually worked. He would shout, looking at Peter and Otto, telling them he was proud of them, and they would look at Harry smiling. Somebody would scream in the room, and the lights would start to flicker, and it would be a energy surge. Peter would yell saying for them to calm down and that it was just an energy spike, and Otto would tell Peter to hurry before it became too strong to control, and Peter would quickly run into the power supply room with Rosie, and Rosie would help Peter, and they would look to see the wires, and they would click the reset button, and Harry's spider sense would go off, and electrical current would go through the power supply brick, and it would go through Peter and Rosie. They would scream in pain, and Peter would fly on the ground, and people would start running, telling them to call 911. Rosie would drop to the ground, and Otto would run looking at her, and he would scream, calling for help, and he would tell them to call 911. Her heart had stopped, and Harry would run into action, and he would jump looking at Peter. His hands were black and he wasn't moving. The ambulance would arrive in time, and Harry would resuscitate Peter, bringing him back to life. The paramedics would tell Otto his wife immediately died from the shock from the machine and that they were really sorry for him. Otto would fall to the ground crying, and he couldn't even believe it. She was dead and it was all his fault. People would leave the building, and Bernard would tell Harry Peter was in critical condition and that he might not make it.